Hello, Booktube. It's time for a book tag, and this is the Nimrod book tag. It was created by Matthew at the Mayberry Bookclub, and it's an original tag. There's 8 questions, and he's tagged me, well, after a fashion, but he's tagged me. Um, Now, this has probably been the only, I'm trying to find the words for this. It's not a challenge. Well, it was a bit. I would say challenge. Okay, that's the simplest word is challenging tag that I've done here. It's mainly because it's made me think of books in a different way, a little bit, but more sort of within a scale, a gray scale of different. But it definitely allows me to distinguish how I normally would think of a book as to for the questions that I'm sort of reappraising things, and that I normally it's not something that sort of comes to mind readily. There might be decisions that are being made subconsciously, which is kind of interesting to now sort of consciously recognize certain aspects of my reading habits. The first question is books that made you feel stupid. And Matthew describes it's not that you're stupid because you don't understand the book. It's basically because there's aspects that you just didn't quite understand for one reason or another. And for me, that would be because the writer is presupposing that you know certain things before you come to this book. Now, that sometimes is a conscious thing by the writer, or it depends on when it was written. Because there are times, at any time, there is a cultural sort of knowledge that most people have, and you don't need to go into detail to explain X, Y, or Z. So, for instance, you read something from 19th century. If it's in English, as if it's British writer, there's a good chance you're going to have biblical references. You're going to have classical mythology references, and other just sort of references to things that were just everyday life. And that obviously, everyday life is no longer the same now. It's not the same to a large extent. And for many decades now, it's not the classical world is not taught, so mythology is not taught. Neither is the biblical stories. And unless somebody has, off their own back, learned these things, they might find it a little difficult to understand. So that's where I think he's coming from. And for me, it's got to do mostly with if try to read a science book, and there's a lot of mathematics involved in it, and sometimes reading the text, I'm lost. I'm lost right at the get go because I don't have the background for this. And then there'll be the science books that will presuppose that you already know these theorems, these theories, the mathematical equations, if it's physics. And still, that can be a little difficult. However, if the book is good, then there will be allusions to sort of describing what the theorem is in words and leave out the mathematics, and that's the only hope I have. And then another one is sort of academic literature studies. I read quite a bit of that for certain periods. The biggest offenders, and I'll use that term, is the essays, the very academic essays. The author is focusing on something extremely narrow to begin with, and then is trying to shoehorn a methodology, usually from a different discipline. And so you need to know what that methodology is and how that methodology works within that discipline. and then hope you can catch up with what they are doing with it in this new discipline. Or simply just that it's so narrow of a concept that, they spend 20 or 30 pages of saying nothing, or at least it appears to me to say nothing. Occasionally I say, well, okay, I get your point. That's an interesting comment, but that's it. Move on. To then, investigate it all this way is sort of, to me, like getting a grant for silly walks. And there's a cultural reference that if some will get it and some may not. But yeah, and then, sometimes I do learn and read later something else, and I go, oh, that coincides with what I read here in this essay. Let me reread this. And a lot of times I'd still come out with the conclusion, you're navel gazing, dude. Plain and simple, you're navel gazing. There's got to be something more that you can do. But anyway, that's, well, what is that? 5 minutes or more on question 1, so we're not doing too well here. Number 2, books you wanted to love but couldn't. Now, I'm taking this to be sort of, if you could create a sort of box of the type of stories that I read, and either nonfiction or fiction. Let's look at fiction for the moment. And you create this box with parameters to it, and you get one, oh, that fits within that, so I should like this. But I don't. And that has happened many times. It's happened with all of Jane Austen's works, Jane Eyre, all that kind of stuff. It just, for some reason, they just did not click with me. The writing I thought was trite. Characters I thought were very flimsy. They did not ring true through the narrative. They just were flimsy. And then I read something else of the period that is similar. Well, those, I may not like the book, but I go, oh, well, at least they're well thought out. That makes sense. It has its own internal structure and logic to it, which Jane Austen and Jane Eyre and Emily the Brontes and so forth don't. It doesn't mean everything that they wrote I don't like. Like I like Emily Bronte's poetry. I like her poetry. And there's many more. Like bringing it up to more modern. For science fiction, you should be able to put into this box, the science fiction box of mine, Philip K. Dick, Robert Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard. Well, Philip K. Dick, some great ideas, but he loses it. I don't know. He just loses it. And his short stories, yes, there's a little better, and maybe because there's a little more constraint, and he's curtailed by the short story format rather than the novel. L. Ron Hubbard, well, once he'd done Dianetics, that was game over for him, I think. So some of his early stuff a little better, but still, I think it's, again, in the short story form that he's a little better. Robert Heinlein. Again, I don't quite like his stuff. Again, some of his short stories are extremely good. There's a few short stories that are very good. And his other sort of non-science fiction writings, like I just got his Grumbles from the Grave, and sort of letters and that's there's some brilliant and insightful things in these letters. So it's not all this that I dislike, but a lot of the books themselves, they should fit into that box, and I should like them, but there's many reasons that I don't. Occasionally I will, revisit these writers, and I will, I'm sure, revisit Jane Austen, Jane Eyre and Emily Bronte, Phil K. Dick, Robert Heinlein, again, someday. And if they then work at that point, then great. If they don't, well, I probably won't try looking at them again. Books you wanted to hate but couldn't. Again, we'll use these boxes that I was talking about, certain things for fiction, say, for instance. And you got a story that doesn't fit in the box, so I'm not going to like it. But I do. And that happens with say, Irvin Welsh's Trainspotting. Brilliant book. Brilliant. But yeah, it does not fit into that box that I was theoretically making, my hypothetical box. It doesn't fit in there, but it works really well. So that's something that I not wanted to hate, but I would have been predisposed to hating until I read it. So I'm always careful with new things. I'm careful. However, there's only so much time to test new things, and unless it's something that I just accidentally find myself, or if somebody that I really, really trust their opinion, and that they do know that I have these weird tangents that I do like occasionally, and they suggest something, that I might look at it. But otherwise, I don't search them out. There's just too much. There's too much to read. There's too much to reread, and just not enough time. Number 4, books you no longer enjoy. Well, it's quite a few things, I suppose. I guess as a genre as thrillers, I no longer enjoy. I used to like them. There was a time in my late teens and early 20s that I read a lot. Either some older ones or saying that, though, okay, I'll make a corollary to this, but more, I guess, modern ones. I'll do that. Sort of more contemporary ones like Robert Ludlum, and that type of stuff. I just cannot read anymore. I attempted to about 8 years ago, 6 to 8 years ago, when I decided to sort of re-explore them, as well as explore written crime mystery, because I sort of held those two together. But I now see that there is difference. There is overlap, obviously, but the difference, and that I do enjoy reading the crime writing now, which I didn't really bother before, because I didn't think it worked. I thought it only worked on TV, on the shows. So, but now I do go back to the writing, but thriller, no. However, saying that, there are a few older thriller writers like Edgar Wallace. I do still enjoy. I still enjoy reading. Phillips Oppenheim, I think it is. Sax Rohmer. There's a whole bunch of those that were at the time that just, they wrote hundreds of books, literally hundreds. That I can still read and enjoy, because I think most of Edgar Wallace's books are classed as thrillers. So I wouldn't probably throw all of thrillers out at the same time, but more sort of contemporary ones, or late 20th century, I would say. Yeah, I think that would be it. Books that won you over on rereading. I have to adapt this one a little bit. There's ones that I reread that I realized, yes, I still like, that I like. And I mentioned I retried doing thrillers, and Robert Ludlum didn't work for me. But I also read at the same time these epic writers, James Michener, James Clavell, John Jakes, and I came across a copy of Michener's Covenant, and I reread that, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it much more than I did the first time. So he is something that I want to try more of his, or reread, and read other ones that I haven't read of his. John Jakes and James Clavell, I probably will not pick up anytime soon because of the subject matter. Basically, does not interest me at the moment to get stuck into something that size. But getting back to sort of won me over. Matthew mentioned that I think it wasn't for this question; it was for another one. That George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, when he read it, he thought they were wonderful. I was completely opposite. When I read those, I had to read those in school and high school, and I just thought they were dreadful. I did not like them, and I just knew I would never read Orwell again. Well, that didn't last a lifetime, that's for sure. Approximately 12, 13 years ago, I started rereading Orwell with Keep the Apodistra Flying, fiction book, and then delved quickly into his essays and other nonfiction. And then I reread 1984 and Animal Farm, as well as read all his fiction. My estimation and judgment of his fiction hasn't really changed. He's not a very good fiction writer. 1984 and Animal Farm are not very well crafted novels. They're actually quite poorly crafted novels. They don't quite hold up internally, structural wise, as well as the logic within it. However, I have been able to appreciate them more, situated within George Orwell's writing, his ethos, his beliefs, and his his sort of even his foibles and everything. I could place it within that and of the time more now, and I can also see how it's affected pop culture and culture in general, and how it's affected some countries and governments where they've banned the book, and it has become a rally for some occasionally. So I can see all those things. It's not that I would say that it's won me over in the rereading, but it's made me appreciate it more. Books you love by a writer you dislike as a person. Okay, well, the one that easily comes to mind is James B Hogan, as a science fiction writer. I like everything that he's written so far that I've read of his fiction, his science fiction. As a person, I don't think he was very nice. He was a climate denier. He denied the Holocaust and AIDS, and just it went on and on. His politics. However, he did not infuse the books with his politics as much. It's there, but it doesn't get in the way of a ripping story. So I do think he's the one that comes readily to mind, because I recently got another novel of his a month or so ago and read it and enjoyed it, but it made me thinking of him again. So, but there's many other authors that I can't think out specifically, but the more you know sometimes of an author, you find out they're not a nice person, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't enjoy their writing. The only time I think that this is where it comes in is if they infuse their whole sort of character of their personal character into the books and to the characters and to the ethos of the book, then I can see that maybe it's not going to work that well. But otherwise, I do separate the writer from the writing. Books you dislike by a writer you like as a person. This was a very difficult question, and I settled on a writer Daniel Richler, which probably is unknown to almost everybody, but you may know his father, Mordecai Richler. Daniel Richler was, he's still alive. He was born in late 50s in London, but he lives in Canada. And during the late 80s and 90s, he's been a broadcaster on TV there. And he's had a few shows that I've really been impressed of. With him especially, it was I think one called Imprint. It was a show about literature, but it wasn't pretentious. And when he was hosting it, when he was in control of it, it was a joy to watch, because even if I disagreed with him, I still I still found it interesting to hear his opinion, and the way he dealt with things too. As I say, it was not pretentious. He started another show called Prisoners of Gravity. It had some faults, but it basically had to do with science fiction. So it started interviewing a lot of science fiction writers, and there is a lot of interviews that are there. That it's the only interviews that have been done by from certain science fiction writers. So it is a bit of a treasure trove and an archive for that. It could have been a lot better, but it was good. However, I then tried reading one of a fiction book that he did, I think in the early 90s. I tried. I couldn't get along with it. So I would say that he fits for that, for number 7. Number 8, books you still want to love one day. Now, Matthew described this more as it could be something that you read you didn't like, but you still think there's something of value and merit there that you would like to go back to, or ones that you liked but you didn't love and would like to go back to. Now, I suppose that could very well be Jane Austen. I would sort of say that, so possibly in the future, because I've had a turnabout with Orwell, with Michener, and with there was another author. I can't think of it. Oh, yeah. Henry James. Oh, I couldn't think of his name. Henry James. These are writers that I basically wrote off that I would never read again. But I have rediscovered them, and Henry James I thoroughly like, and I want to read more of his stuff. And I think another one is Trollope. I sort of there was a period that I sort of gave up on English 19th century authors, and that was after reading Jane Austen, and I did all these back to back, basically Jane Austen, Jane Eyre, Emily Bronte, the Brontes, and I just couldn't abide anything more that was English, even though I still liked Dickens to a certain extent. But I left sort of England, and I didn't read anything that was 19th century English for a long time. I read 18th century, yes, but I switched to French authors for 19th century, with Balzac, Dumas, Zola, Daudet, and now Flaubert I liked, and I like him now more. The list goes on. I can't even think of all of them, but yeah, there's a lot of 19th century French writers that I thoroughly enjoyed, and that's where I switched to. But anyway, that's getting off topic. So we'll end it there. It's almost 25 minutes, and that is the Nimrod book tag. Because I've struggled with this, I don't want to specifically tag anybody else. But if anybody is interested in to do it, by all means. It is an interesting tag. So thank you, Matthew, for tagging me, and we'll see you again. Bye.